Introduction. Why medieval peasants burned bones in -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Winters. Before we go back in time, pause for a moment in the present. Every year, even with modern heating, insulated homes, and high-tech clothing, nearly 20,000 people around the world still die from cold exposure. In the United States alone, over 1,000 lives are lost to hypothermia in a single year. These are people living inside functioning power grids, people with thermostats, jackets, and emergency services. And yet, when the systems we rely on fail, our bodies fail with them. Now imagine a world with none of that safety net. No central heating, no insulated walls, no electricity, just wind, hunger, and winter. Welcome back to Historia Prime. Today we uncover a survival strategy so brilliant, so misunderstood, and so deeply forgotten that it rewrites how we see medieval life. Picture Europe in the Little Ice Age. From the 14th century onward, temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped so sharply that winters behaved more like the modern Arctic. Cold snaps between 1300 and 1850 were relentless. Rivers froze solid for months at a time. The Thames turned into a highway of ice where Londoners built frost fairs, raced horses, and lit fires directly on the frozen surface. And across the continent, temperatures routinely plunged to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. In this frozen world, the medieval peasant lived in a drafty wattle and daub hut where heat vanished through every crack. Their clothing was rough wool and linen, worn for endless months. Their bodies were weakened by hunger after the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when freezing rains destroyed crops and starvation spread like wildfire. A starving body loses heat faster than it can produce it. Cold became a predator. By modern logic, they should have died. Entire villages should have frozen in their sleep. But they didn't. They survived winter after winter, not because they had better firewood, but because they understood fire differently than we do. When the firewood ran out, they burned bones. Yes, bones. Not out of desperation, but as a deliberate, engineered thermal strategy. A method grounded in physics, fat content, and heat stability. A method that provided hotter, longer-lasting, more radiant warmth than wood ever could. And once you learn how and why they did it, you will never look at a simple bone the same way again. Chapter 1. The Catastrophic Medieval Fuel Crisis. Before we can understand why medieval peasants burned bones to survive -30-degree winters, we first need to step into the crisis that pushed them towards such an unlikely fuel. For centuries, Europe lived through a slow-motion disaster that almost no modern history book explains. It was a fuel collapse, quiet, relentless, and absolute. Between the years 1000 and 1300, Europe's population didn't simply grow, it exploded. It tripled. And every new mouth meant new farmland to clear, new houses to build, new fires to keep lit through long winters. At the same time, medieval engineering, brilliant, ambitious, and resource-hungry, devoured wood at a staggering scale. Cathedrals rose into the sky on skeletons of ancient oak. Naval fleets multiplied, stripping coastal forests bare, and looming over everything was the iron industry. To smelt a single pound of iron, a blacksmith needed 8 cubic feet of charcoal. That meant burning forests, not branches, not deadwood, but entire ecosystems, just to create the fuel that powered the medieval world. Historians call this era of voracious consumption the Great Clearance. By the time William the Conqueror announced his Doomsday Survey in 1086, England's forests were already shrinking. And by the 14th century, tree cover in Central Europe had collapsed in some regions by as much as 70%. What vanished wasn't just wood. It was warmth. It was security. It was the buffer between life and death in winter. But the crisis wasn't only ecological, it was political. As wood became as valuable as gold, the nobility and the crown tightened their grip on the last remaining forests. Long-standing peasant rights, known as estovers, the simple right to collect fallen branches, was stripped away. These forests became royal preserves, hunting parks, or strategic timber reserves for war. And when survival collided with law, the punishment was brutal. A peasant caught gathering illegal firewood might face crippling fines, torture, or execution. Imagine standing outside your freezing cottage, watching frost crawl across the walls, knowing your children are shivering behind you, and knowing that the forest, dark, vast, full of the wood that could save them, is forbidden. One step across that boundary and warming your home becomes a crime. So peasants did what humans have always done when abandoned by the systems meant to protect them. They adapted. They built an underground survival economy, a desperate but ingenious way of extracting heat from anything the world placed in their hands. Historians call it the economy of makeshifts, a world where every scrap of material, every byproduct of labor, every overlooked piece of the natural world became a potential source of life. And at the heart of this forgotten survival system was one resource nobody expected: the bones of the very animals that fed and clothed them. Chapter 2. The Genius Thermodynamics of Burning Bones. This is the moment where the forgotten brilliance of the medieval bone fire comes into full focus. To us, a bone is nothing more than a dry stick of calcium, something lifeless and inert. But to a medieval peasant, facing a -30-degree night with no wood left to burn, a bone was not waste. It was engineered fuel. It was survival wrapped in biology and chemistry. And they understood its secrets long before science could explain them. Fresh animal bone is not just hard stuff. It is a composite material, part mineral, part protein, part water, and part pure stored energy. Roughly 65% of a bone is inorganic mineral, mostly hydroxyapatite, a crystalline structure that can withstand incredible heat without turning to ash. Another 25% is organic matter, primarily collagen, and about 10% is water. And it is that organic matter, the collagen, that unlocks the first layer of bone's hidden power. Collagen carbonizes at low temperatures, keeping a fire alive when wood would already be sputtering out. But the real force inside a bone, the true energy bomb, is its fat. Marrow fat. The thick, sticky grease packed into the spongy ends of long bones. Animal fat burns hotter than almost any natural household fuel. Under the right conditions, it can push combustion past 1,000 degrees Celsius. In other words, a bone is a long, dense tube of oil-soaked thermal potential, something every medieval family relied on long before anyone understood the word calorific. Only recently did modern experimental archaeologists confirm what medieval peasants already knew by intuition. In landmark studies by researchers like Isabelle Théry-Parisot and Marina Nestorova, controlled bone-burning experiments produced results that stunned the scientific community. While seasoned hardwood fires typically peak around 600 or 700 degrees Celsius, fresh bone fires surged to 800, even 900 degrees. A jump of nearly 200 degrees, achieved from something most modern people throw in the trash. And yet, raw heat wasn't even the true advantage. The real superpower of a bone fire is its stability. If you've ever tended a wood fire, you know the pattern. A burst of flames, a rush of heat, then a rapid collapse into ash. Peaks, crashes, drafts, and cold again. Bone rewrites that rhythm. A bone fire burns with a steady, disciplined intensity. It holds its heat, releases it slowly, and stretches it through long hours of brutal winter. That stability comes from the architecture of the bone itself. Spongy bone, cancellous bone found in the pelvis, spine, and limb ends, is full of tiny chambers, each holding fat and allowing air to pass through naturally. It is a built-in, slow-release fuel capsule designed by nature, perfected by hardship. Meanwhile, the mineral matrix, the hydroxyapatite, refuses to burn away. Instead, it acts like thermal mass. It absorbs the violent heat of the burning fats and collagen, then radiates that energy back into the room as long-wave infrared warmth. To understand the difference, picture this. Wood burns like paper, fast, bright, and mostly upward, sending its heat racing through the roof hole of a medieval cottage. Bone burns like a dense coal briquette, slow, steady, and outward. It radiates into walls, into clothing, into skin. It warms bodies instead of just warming air. And in a winter where the world sits at -30 degrees Fahrenheit, radiant heat is not a luxury. It is the difference between waking up and never waking up again. This was not desperation. This was engineering. This was thermodynamics in the hands of people with no textbooks, no laboratories, and no electricity, only the relentless will to survive. Chapter 3. How to build a medieval bone fire. So the question becomes, how did medieval peasants actually do it? How did they turn the remains of an animal into a heat source powerful enough to fight a -30-degree winter? The truth is that bone burning wasn't random and it wasn't constant. It followed the rhythm of the agricultural calendar, woven directly into the cycle of survival. Across Europe, November was the traditional slaughter month. As the days shortened and the fields emptied, every family faced a hard calculation. Which animals could they afford to feed through the barren winter? And which ones had to be butchered before the world froze over? What followed was a ritual of absolute efficiency, because in medieval philosophy, nothing, absolutely nothing, was wasted. The meat was salted and smoked to carry families through months of scarcity. The hides were scraped and tanned into leather. The sinew became bowstrings and cordage. The fat was rendered down into tallow for lamps. The marrow, rich, warm, and life-saving, was cracked open and eaten immediately as a famine-breaking superfood. And then finally, the bare skeleton, now soaked in grease and marrow residue, was set aside not as trash but as fuel. Yet even here there was a technical challenge. Bone doesn't ignite on its own. You can hold a torch to a femur all night and nothing will happen. Because bone conducts heat poorly, it cannot begin combustion without a foundation. Modern experimental archaeology confirms what peasants already knew. You need a baseline fire of wood or brush, at least 15% of the total fuel, just to raise the hearth to ignition temperature. But once that kindling lifted the fire above roughly 300 degrees Celsius, the transformation began. The collagen inside the bone charred. The trapped grease melted, wicked through the porous structure, and burst into flame. The marrow lipids vaporized into a steady, radiant burn. At that moment, the bone stopped being a carcass, stopped being a remnant of the slaughter yard, and became the thermal backbone of the home. It burned slow, it burned hot, it burned steady, and because of that, it carried families through the longest, darkest winter nights. This practice was so common, so deeply rooted in medieval daily life, that it left a permanent mark on our language. The word bonfire was never meant to mean good fire. Its earliest spelling in the 14th century makes the truth obvious. B-O-N-E-F-I-R-E. A bonfire was literally a fire built from bones. Every time we say the word today, we unknowingly echo the survival ingenuity of our ancestors. And buried in that old spelling is a reminder. What they burned was not desperation. It was design. It was knowledge. It was a mastery of resources so complete that even the skeleton of an animal became a weapon against the cold. Chapter 4. The toxic alternatives: peat, dung, and sea coal. The medieval economy of makeshifts did not end with bones. When winter pressed in and survival became a negotiation with death itself, peasants burned anything the earth would allow. And what the earth offered was often harsh, filthy, and punishing. In the wetlands of northern Europe, Ireland, and the Netherlands, the only available fuel was the ground beneath people's feet. Communities carved peat out of freezing bogs, thick, soggy layers of partially decayed plants, essentially the infant stage of coal. The work was brutal. Each block of peat was heavy, dripping, and 90% water, which meant the bricks had to sit in the wind all summer just to become remotely burnable. When finally dried, peat smouldered with a long, low heat. It burned slowly, faithfully, but at a terrible cost. Peat smoke was acrid and oily. It filled low ceilings, stung eyes, triggered constant coughing, and left entire villages breathing air that poisoned them season after season. In the high moorlands, where the wind howled and no trees could survive, peasants turned to gorse, furze, and heather. These thorn-covered shrubs grew where nothing else would. Gathering them tore skin, ripped clothing, and exhausted those who were already half-starved. The shrubs had to be singed to remove their needles, and only then could they produce enough heat to push back the frost creeping under cottage doors. And then came the most agonizing choice of all: dung. In treeless regions, cow and sheep droppings became a lifeline. Families mixed dung with straw, plastered the patties on their cottage walls, and waited for the wind to dry them into fuel. Dried dung burned surprisingly well, giving off a long, steady warmth, much like peat. But using it came at a terrible moral and agricultural price. Dung was fertilizer, literal life for next season's crops. Every basket burned in the hearth was nutrition stolen from the earth. Every flame carried the question no parent wanted to face. Do I stay warm tonight, or do I feed my children next spring? Meanwhile, in crowded medieval cities like London, another option washed ashore: sea coal. This black rock, imported from Newcastle as the wood crisis deepened, was dense, powerful, and devastatingly dirty. Loaded with sulfur and bitumen, it filled homes with thick yellow smoke when burned in chimneys that were never designed for it. The soot blackened walls, coated lungs, and triggered what may have been Europe's first true air pollution revolt. In 1285, Londoners protested its use. King Edward I even attempted to ban it. But the truth was simple and cruel. People would rather breathe poison than freeze to death. And this is where the true brilliance of the bonfire becomes unmistakable. Against the desperation of peat, the sacrifice of burned dung, and the choking toxicity of sea coal, bone stands apart. It does not steal from the soil. It does not suffocate households. It burns hotter, cleaner, steadier. In a world crushed by scarcity, the bonfire was not a primitive fallback. It was a quiet masterpiece of sustainable, localized survival engineering. The kind of knowledge forged not in laboratories, but in the daily fight to live through one more night of impossible cold. Chapter 5. An ancient survival hack. From Neanderthals to the Ice Age. Here is the part of the story that truly bends the mind. Medieval peasants did not invent the bonfire. They simply revived a survival technology far older than castles, older than agriculture, older even than our own species' memory. When they burned bones to survive -30-degree winters, they were tapping into a bloodline of firecraft that stretches back more than 100,000 years. 125,000 years ago, during a savage interglacial period in what is now central Germany, Neanderthals operated what archaeologists today call prehistoric fat factories. At the site of Neumark Nord, too, these early humans did not just break bones for marrow. They crushed the skeletons of more than 170 giant mammals into tens of thousands of fragments. They boiled those fragments to render calorie-rich grease, a substance that fed their bodies, and almost certainly fed their fires. Even then, long before the first written word, humans already understood that bone was not refuse. It was fuel. If we move forward to the last glacial maximum, the coldest chapter of the Ice Age, between 26,000 and 19,000 years ago, we find an environment that makes the Little Ice Age look like a mild frost. In what is now Ukraine, forests had vanished entirely. The land was a frozen, treeless steppe swept by monstrous winds. Wood didn't exist, and yet humans lived there. In 1965, a farmer digging a cellar in Mazirich unearthed something extraordinary: a mammoth jawbone. Archaeologists soon discovered entire dwellings built entirely from mammoth bones, arranged in circles like rib cages of stone. And inside the hearths of those bone houses, they found the proof of an ancient strategy. Burned mammoth bone fragments lay mixed with animal fat and scraps of brush. Modern analysis revealed what these Ice Age families had achieved. By combining bone with fat in perfect ratio, they sustained hearth temperatures above 600 degrees Celsius, enough to survive in a world where winter never ended. And this tradition did not disappear. In the Arctic, Inuit communities burned caribou bones when driftwood was scarce. In the steppe, nomads reused every part of an animal, including its skeleton, for heat. And in 14th century Europe, medieval peasants fighting their own climatic catastrophe rediscovered the same truth. The animal skeleton is a thermal machine. Across continents and epochs, from Neanderthal fat factories to mammoth bone houses on the Ice Age tundra to the bone-fueled hearths of medieval cottages, humans have always understood the physics hidden in a bone. They learned that inside every carcass lies stored energy, slow-release heat, radiant warmth, and the power to endure a winter that should have killed them. This wasn't insanity, it wasn't desperation, it was mastery, an ancient science of survival carved into our species long before we learned to write it down. Conclusion: the fragility of modern comfort. So the final question is this: why don't we know any of this today? How did a survival skill that carried humanity through ice, famine, and extinction-level cold simply vanish from our collective memory? It wasn't erased in a single moment. It was replaced slowly and systematically. First came the Black Death in the mid-14th century, a catastrophe that wiped out as much as 60% of Europe's population. Suddenly there were fewer mouths to feed, vast fields lay abandoned, and forests, once stripped bare, began to regrow. Wood became plentiful again, and the urgency that had driven bone burning faded. Then came fossil fuels. Coal, once despised as a foul, choking rock, became the beating engine of the Industrial Revolution. And as industrial society grew, the humble bone found new, profitable lives outside the hearth. Bone meal became fertilizer. Bone char purified sugar on a global scale. Bone glue held together the world's furniture and books. Bone ash shaped fine ceramics. Industry after industry discovered value in bone, and the ancient fire that once lit the nights of our ancestors slipped quietly out of human consciousness. Today, we toss a soup bone into the trash without a second thought. Hunters leave skeletons in the forest to rot. Homesteaders bury animal remains in compost or feed them to the dogs. But a medieval peasant would look at that same waste and see 6 to 8 hours of radiant, high-temperature heat, warmth that could mean the difference between life and death. And this leads us to the uncomfortable truth about our modern world. We live in an age of unprecedented comfort, yet also unprecedented fragility. Our warmth depends on global supply chains, fragile power grids, and complex pipelines. We abandoned the rugged, improvisational economy of makeshifts that once allowed ordinary people to survive any crisis. We replaced it with an infrastructure that works flawlessly, right up until the moment it doesn't. If the lights went out tonight, if a winter storm cut the grid, if the firewood ran out, most of us would have no fallback at all. But the medieval peasant did. In a drafty cottage, under a howling sky, they turned what remained of the animal that clothed and fed them into a thermal engine that burned hotter than wood and lasted longer than wood. It was the ultimate closed-loop system of survival, a fusion of necessity and ingenuity. And here is the twist. The bones are still here, in slaughterhouses, in hunting camps, on dinner plates. The resource never disappeared, only our ability to recognize it did. So we must ask ourselves, how vulnerable have we become by forgetting the ancient knowledge that built our civilization? If the grid failed tomorrow, if the wind turned sharp and the snow began to fall, what would you burn to stay alive? Thank you for watching Historia Prime. This is where we rediscover the lost technologies, the forgotten resilience, and the hidden science that kept humanity alive for millennia. If this journey changed how you see the past, and perhaps how you prepare for the future, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. Have you ever used an unusual fuel to keep warm during a cold night? Tell us your story. Stay curious, stay resilient, and we will see you in the next era.